All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out to Startup Boston Week. My name is Andy. I am one of the organizers of this event. I have been doing Startup Boston for a few years now. So at this point, I'm a veteran, and this has become a fun tradition for me. And I hope you guys make it a tradition for yourselves. Um, so on my screen, I'm going to pull this up real quickly. Uh, you'll see the agenda of what's happening right now. If you did not mean to be in raising your Series A, now is your chance to click away on agenda and go to the correct session. If you are here, we're super excited to have you. We have some great guests from McCarter in English who are going to take us through our Series A negotiations. And so as we do so, though, Matt and Ben are going to be taking questions as well. So you can post those in the Q&A, where we really want you guys to ask questions. That's what this conference is all about. It's all about getting knowledge to you all. And if you have questions you want answered, please go ahead and ask them in there. Both me and Matt and Ben should be able to look at those and respond, some at the end and some throughout. So again, I mentioned that Matt and Ben are both from McCarter English. And so I'd love to say a quick thank you to them, to McCarter English. Definitely check them out by clicking the link in the Docs tab, which is on the right-hand side of your screen. You can also visit their virtual booth by clicking the Partners Navigation tab at the top after this session. So with that, I'm really excited to hand it over to Matt and Ben, and thanks for your time.
Thank you, Andy. I can't exactly tell who's on. It's a new platform for me, so we're gonna do the best we can with this, and hopefully you guys will have a little bit of patience with us. So my name's Ben Hron. I'm a partner in the Boston office of McCarter in English, where I focus on representing startups and emerging growth companies. And I'm here today, as Andy said, with my partner, Matt Uretskty, to talk about term sheets, in particular Series A term sheets. Matt and I are both members of McCarter's venture capital and emerging growth companies practice, which brings together over 30 attorneys from a range of disciplines to advise entrepreneurs on nearly all aspects of their business. So collectively, we have helped guide thousands of entrepreneurs from formation to financing to exit. In 2021 alone, so far, we've helped clients raise more than $3 billion. And our focus representing startups and emerging growth companies is really sort of what originally brought us to Startup Boston Week. We've now been a sponsor for the last several years, and we're thrilled to be back again this year, not only as a sponsor, but also as presenters. So I want to give Matt a chance to say a few words about himself, and then we'll dive into the content of this.
Thanks, Ben. Keep it brief. My name is Matt Uretskty. I, too, am partner at McCarter in our venture capital and emerging growth company practice. I am sitting here in central New Jersey. I split my time between there and the New York City region, but work with clients all over the place in the same types of matters as Ben. Work with startups, early stage companies, and the investors that support them, and really anyone else in the ecosystem. Supporting companies pre-formation through the entire company lifecycle. And those are the most rewarding clients for me, and I suppose Ben, to work with. The ones where we can start when it's back of the napkin stage, a couple friends out of B school, say, and then we can, work through those various company milestones all the way to clinking champagne glasses at the exit event. The Series A term sheet, the Series A financing is, one of the most significant milestones along that journey. The first, in all likelihood, significant institutional investor financing. So I'm looking forward to digging in deeper about some of the hows, whys, who's, what's, and where. So I'll turn it over to Ben.
Yeah, and so Matt and I are going to do a lot of back and forth here, but just to set the stage, what we really want you guys to do, you probably know something about Series A terms. You've probably heard things about them, but we want to put things in context. As Matt said, this is really a seminal event in the early life cycle of a company, and we want you to think about how it's going to impact you in the future. So as you sit here listening to us talk, think about the future of your business after raising the capital. How does that affect your business? What does it do? Obviously, it's going to have an impact on your ability to scale more quickly, to hire people. But it's also going to come with some challenges. And so think through, what does it mean to have investors involved in your company, possibly having board seats, as we'll talk about a little bit. And just, if you think of concerns you might have, things that come up as, oh geez, what am I going to do about this, and how's this going to impact my business? Drop them into the chat or the Q&A so we can try to touch upon them as we go through things. So anyway, with that, the basic agenda here is Matt's going to talk a little bit about what a term sheet is, why it's important. I'm going to give a little bit of an overview of different types of terms and term sheets, and then we're going to go through and talk in more detail about specific terms in the term sheets. And we may not hit on every single term, but we'll definitely hit on the terms that are most important for you to be focused on as an entrepreneur when you actually get a term sheet from an investor. Matt?
Thank you, Ben. You spurred a couple thoughts, which I think are important to get off the bat at the start. If anyone has any questions, shoot them in the Q&A. We will do our best to either address them in time or probably more likely at the end. We're going to save time to do that. And that is kind of part and parcel of a bigger point. Ben and I are here to be a resource for everyone. So to the extent that something comes up, maybe while we're talking about it, it all makes sense. And then there's one thing that's sticking in your craw tomorrow night, email us a question. We're here to be a resource for everyone out there, regardless of the fact that we can't see you all. We suspect there are folks out there, and we want to be a resource for all of you.
And Matt, we should mention somewhere in here, there should be the ability to download or view this term sheet.
Yes, there should be a term sheet, a link to a term sheet that we're not going to present from necessarily, but it will be a good reference point. We've included the link here we've attempted to include the link here, as I say, for reference purposes, and so that you can toggle between the things we're talking about and maybe what that language might actually look like in a term sheet. So when we talk about term sheets, what do we even mean? Well, simply put, a Series A term sheet is going to be a summary of the key terms of that Series A financing. Maybe to take a half step back, when we're talking about a Series A financing, we're talking about a transaction in which company, or a company, is issuing shares of its preferred capital stock to an investor or series of investors. So that's going to mean that the company is going to have to create that class of stock. It's going to need to define the rights of that new class of preferred stock. How much is it going to cost? Sorry, I heard something in the background there. How much are investors going to be paying for these new shares? So at its most basic level, the term sheet is just going to be a document that sets forth the parties' understanding of the deal. And at its simplest form, the deal is going to be VC1 as lead investor is negotiating on behalf of all the Series A investors in a transaction in which the Series A investors as a whole may be putting in, say, $8 million on a pre-money company valuation of X and purchasing Y percentage of the company. You will note that all term sheets will say that they're non-binding. And well, what does that mean? It means that we're going through this negotiation process, but nothing in here actually matters. And my answer to that is, well, sorta, except that more than anything, both the lead VC negotiating this term sheet and the company have their reputations on the line. And while typically nothing in the term sheet will be binding, the way that negotiations went down and the way the transaction ultimately proceeded in light of what was purported to be agreed upon at the term sheet will be notable. And for that reason, we very rarely see really investors or companies renege much if at all, on terms that were set forth in the term sheet. In other words, once these term sheets are signed, these deals typically get done. The term sheet's important because while it may not be binding, it sets forth everyone's expectations about the deal. There's going to be scores of negotiation points, some of which we'll talk about in this chat, but there are so many more potential points for negotiation than are cognizable to be set forth in a term sheet that it behooves us all to isolate what everyone agrees are the most material terms, get agreement on them so that both parties don't incur the time and expense of negotiating the definitive documents. There will be hundreds of pages of definitive transaction documents, and getting down that road and then realizing that there was actually a disagreement regarding some fundamental economic term that calls into question the entire transaction. Typically, the way this will work, term sheet gets signed, counsel to the investor or the company prepares initial drafts. That'll take about a week. The more fulsome the term sheet, the less room for subsequent negotiation. The less fulsome the term sheet, the more potential for subsequent negotiation of points around the margins. It'll typically take, say, 2, 3, 4 weeks to negotiate final documents. At that point, you're soliciting for signatures and looking to close. Just a couple, and sorry to belabor this, who starts the term sheet? Typically, VCs will prepare the term sheet. Company will respond. It's always best for company counsel, or from the company's perspective, it's always best to prepare the term sheet, to prepare the documents themselves. One more thing. Actually, I'll kick it over to Ben, but before we get too deep in the weeds.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, when you're looking at the term sheet, it's easy to get a little overwhelmed by the various terms in there. There's a lot of jargon in there that's sort of understood by industry veterans, particularly the lawyers and the VCs. But you, particularly if you're a first-time entrepreneur, it can be a little problematic. That's interesting. I just got distracted by the message that popped up on the screen. We'll come back to that. How do I make that go? Disappear.
Doing my best here, Ben. Sorry about that.
What?
Doing my best here. Sorry.
No. So the first thing we want to talk a little bit about is the differences between the two types of terms that you see in the term sheet. Broadly speaking, you can take all the terms in the term sheet and break them down to what we call economic terms and control terms. Economic terms are terms that basically go to who's going to get the money at the end of the day, who gets a bigger slice of the pie. Control terms are, as we go along, who's making decisions about the day-to-day operations of the company and then about the major events in the company's life cycle. And that becomes important because inevitably there's some push and pull between the two of them. You'll hear investors sometimes talk about basically, you want the money, you want the bigger slice of the pie, then I want more control over day-to-day operations and major events, and vice versa. Because inevitably you can actually help to influence the outcomes and the eventual economics if you control things, even if you don't have as large a slice of the pie. So it's just something to be aware of. So for example, things that are obvious economic terms are the valuation, what's called a liquidation preference, something that's called anti-dilution, which we'll talk about later. Things that are more on the lines of control terms are who's on the board of directors, who gets to vote on certain fundamental decisions that the company has to make, or things like a sale of the company. Who gets to participate in future rounds of financing? That can actually be both economic and control. So as you're going through, you want to sort of think about that broadly, and that'll give you some context for understanding whether, basically how the terms interplay and where you can give and take a little bit. So Matt, I think we're diving right now into other terms. Okay. So the other thing that we want to sort of point out to you is that there's a handful of terms in the term sheet that are what I call bellwether terms, right? So they're not terms that are necessarily negotiated a lot, because usually in 90% of the deals, there's not much to negotiate. Everybody knows what they're typically going to be, and the term sheet will come across with standard terms, and there'll be nothing to talk about. But in those situations where they're not, where the term sheet doesn't have those standard terms, you're going to want to be aware of it, because it's sort of a red flag that maybe the terms aren't as friendly. Maybe there's other things in the term sheet that you want to look out for. And there's 4 of them in particular. One is the liquidation preference I mentioned earlier. In an early stage financing, particularly a seed or a Series A, we expect to see something from investors that's called, usually referred to as a 1x non-participating preferred stock. That means that if there's an exit event, the investors get their money back, or they get to convert into common stock and participate with everybody else, right? So the investors get a downside protection, meaning they get their money back before anybody else shares, but they don't have any special rights on the upside, any special economic rights on the upside. The company does phenomenally well. They just participate with everybody else. If the term sheet you get doesn't have those terms, if it has either a participation preference that's more than 1 times the money back, or if it includes what's called a participation, meaning that after the investors get their preference, they then participate with the common stockholders, that's a pretty good indication that there's something afoot there, and that you should pay attention to the rest of the term sheet.
Ben, if I can jump in on this point, I mean, I think that this is a good jumping off point for a point or something to take away generally regarding this discussion, which is that the terms we're assuming here that the Series A is the company's first real priced equity round. In that round, the company, you're going to be setting precedent for every round that it's not going to be in your Series A lead investor's interest to set some way off, I mean, either off market or way off market, but off market liquidation preference or redemption right or dividend right or anti-dilution protection, all the things we're going to talk about. But it's not going to be in anyone's interest, including your Series A investor, to set terms that are so off the wall that they're going to be an impediment to future financings or otherwise, prove so onerous or I guess onerous as the company continues to make money that they're going to prove an impediment to financing. So here, my point is, with a liquidation preference, if what we're saying, if an investor is trying to propose that they get a 2x non-participating liquidation preference, they're essentially saying that, okay, off the top, my downside protection is 2x whatever I put in. So, okay, if you're doing, let's say, a Series seed round of financing and you take in $1.5 million, maybe at $3 million off the top isn't necessarily so onerous because, of course, everyone's envisioning a much larger exit way down the road. But if you add on top of that your Series A having a 2x preference and your Series B and C having a 2x preference, you enter, which undoubtedly folks will ask for because the precedent has been set, you end up with an extremely large and difficult to maneuver around liquidation stack, as we call it.
Yeah. And so, and again, I think that, this is part of the reason we're pointing this out is we're not trying to tell you this is normal. We're trying to tell you it's not normal, right? And by the way, we are seeing the questions in the Q&A. We will talk through them. We're just going to try to, move along a little bit first, and then we'll address them. So the next one in there is anti-dilution, and the industry standard here is what's called weighted average anti-dilution, and that means basically if you sell shares in the future at a lower price than the round you're selling at, now, the investors get an adjustment to their preferred stock that essentially lets them convert into a higher number of shares of common stock. Now, at the earliest stage, it's unusual that you would have a future round at a lower price, but it happens. And weighted average takes into consideration not just the difference in the price between this round and the what's called down round in the future, but also the number of shares you're selling. The alternative to that is something called full ratchet anti-dilution. Full ratchet anti-dilution says, look, if you're selling at $1 now and you sell a single share later for 50 cents, then you're suddenly going to treat this, you're going to basically adjust the conversion rate of your preferred stock into common based on that 50-cent share, even though it's only one share that you sold at 50 cents. That is extremely punitive and extremely unusual, to the point that the National Venture Capital Association, which basically is this industry organization that puts out these standard terms that are pretty much universally used or almost universally used by attorneys and investors, has actually taken it out of their term sheet because it's so rare. So you shouldn't expect to see that. If you do see it, it's another red flag. Matt, anything to add?
No, just to belabor the point, which is that if you see anything that is not full ratchet, that is not weighted average cost of capital anti-dilution, it is an extreme red flag.
Yeah. So the next one is redemption rights. Redemption rights are what they sound like. It is basically the right of the investor to force the company to buy the shares back. That is something that is, again, unusual, particularly at this stage. If you see it, it is another marker that maybe the term sheet isn't so friendly, or you're dealing with somebody who is, sort of not necessarily along for the ride in the way you would expect an early stage seed investor or Series A investor to be. That
and that last point there, I think, is like really the crucial part. That, you know, if any of these terms, or some of the others as well, you know, you can get an insight into what the investor's thinking, and if they're pushing for some sort of redemption right where they can essentially get out of this, let's say 5 years down the road, whenever they want, then they might not necessarily be aligned with how this typically works for a Series A preferred stock investment with a relatively long, path to monetization. And, it can be illustrative of how the relationship very well may go, if ultimately you bring these folks on as lead investors.
Yeah. The last one I really want to point out is what's called founders' representations and warranties. The company is expected to make some statements in the purchase agreement that talks about the company and its history, and it gives the investors a way of knowing what they don't know. It's a risk shifting tool. That's standard, but asking the founders to go on the hook personally about some of these things has become less and less standard. It does still happen in certain circumstances, but if it happens, it's usually only in the first institutional round, a Series Seed or a Series A if there wasn't a prior Series Seed. And it is, again, just something that you should be aware is not common these days. So, and it definitely increases your risk. Matt, anything to add?
No, let's start talking about key terms.
All right, let's start talking about key terms. So look, now we're going to dive into sort of the stuff that really is more commonly negotiated in a typical term sheet. We're going to dive right in with the one everybody sort of focuses on first, which is the valuation. The valuation obviously varies depending on the circumstances. So we can't talk about, should your valuation be higher or lower, but we can talk a little bit about what impacts your valuation. And in particular, we want you to understand that the dollar value that you see on the term sheet as, this is at a pre-money valuation of $15 million, is not actually, doesn't tell the whole story. Because what that amount includes or could include are a handful of things that that you might not be thinking about. And in particular, I want to point out the conversion of existing convertible securities. So specifically, if you've raised money already through convertible debt or through what's called a SAFE, a simple agreement for future equity, that is going to convert into equity in that round, in this round, those things are typically going to be included in that pre-money valuation, right? In addition, usually what's included in the pre-money valuation is the option pool and any options that are already outstanding. So say, for example, that you've got 1 million shares of stock outstanding and a $15 million valuation. You might think to yourself, great, stock's all worth $15 a share. But then when you add in the conversion of the safes, the conversion of the notes, the option pool, you may suddenly find that stock isn't worth $15 a share. It's really being valued at more like, $12 a share, $10 a share, something like that. And so it's important for you to internalize that when you're thinking about how much the company is really, how much the investors are really paying, and how much of the company you're going to own after the transaction.
Yeah. Ben mentioned a couple. He spoke about pre-money valuation in there. Recognize pre-money valuation and post-money valuation are two very different things. And there are many ways to slice the valuation pie in a term sheet. Ben and I'm sure have, or I know I have, and I'm sure Ben has seen all sorts of permutations that either make clear or confuse the issue as to whether, for instance, the size of the option pool, whether converting securities are taken into account. And from the VC's perspective, let's first take the option pool. The VC wants, for one, let's start from the premise that it is a standard term in the marketplace in a Series A deal for the company to reserve something like 10 to 15% of its post-closing cap table for grants under its option plan. Okay. Now, that entire option plan, including the amount that we might be increasing the plan by in connection with this deal to get to a 10% or 15% unallocated pool, all of that is typically taken into account in the pre-money valuation. So, or in determining the price. So in Ben's formula, where it's valuation over outstanding shares, that outstanding shares denominator gets larger because we're building in all of the entire option pool, not just, say, the part of your option pool that might be currently allocated for outstanding grants. Recognize that the larger that denominator gets in the deal, the lower the purchase price gets. As an investor, I know that similarly situated companies are going to need to expend, say, 10 to 15% or probably more of their post-closing cap table to incentivize employees, consultants, directors, everybody else. I don't want to be diluted by those shares that I know are going to be issued. And on the convertible security side, safes and convertible notes that are outstanding. Again, those are typically, at least if the VCs have their way, those are typically accounted for in the pre-money valuation and thereby lower the purchase price. So that denominator we were talking about goes from, let's say, 1 million shares. You add in the option pool, it's 1.2 million shares. There's another 300,000 of shares issued on conversion of notes. It gets even bigger, thereby reducing the price even further. The rationale there from the investor is that, hey, you already did those capital raises where you raised, $1.5 million on a note or on a safe. Now all we're doing is just, formalizing the arrangement that you made back then. We're going to treat all of those shares that we're going to issue on conversion as baked into the pre-money. Now, there is some room to negotiate these terms. I will tell you that, and Ben, I'm curious if your experience differs. More, by and large, investors are going to include the plan, the entire plan, and converting securities in that pre-money, fully diluted cap number. It's an uphill battle to negotiate against that. But I see it.
I think that the issue with the pre-money and the option pool is not whether or not it's included, it's how big is it. So, from the investor's perspective, there's a tendency, I think, to sort of reflexively say, we want a 20% or a 15% post-money option pool. But from the company's perspective, it really depends on the circumstance. If you are a startup that already has your core team in place, you've got a good, a good CEO, a good technical co-founder, you've sort of got 3 or 4 people that really can be the C-level team for a while going forward, and you expect that in the next 12 to 24 months, you're going to be bringing people in, but it's going to be at 0.5% a piece for a little bit of equity. That's a very different situation than somebody who's raising money as a solo founder or maybe 2 people, but they know they need to bring in a real sort of somebody or other on the team that's going to require more equity. And if you can basically justify the size of your option pool, that's usually pretty compelling, and it requires a little work. What it requires doing is presenting the investors with something that realistically says, look, these people are already in the fold, and we think that this is our plan for hiring over the next 12 to 24 months. This is how much equity we think is appropriate to be offering them. We don't think we need an option pool this large. And I found that is probably the most effective way of negotiating that point. Matt?
Yeah, I think to keep things moving, let's talk about board composition. Either the top level item along with valuation, or maybe the second item after valuation is, what's the board going to look like going forward? For founding teams, that first taste of needing to give up some board control is often met with resistance, but as lead investor in, all other things being equal, a market Series A round, your lead investor is going to expect a seat on your board. Depending on what your current board structure looks like, there are a number of ways to ensure that the common stockholders continue to have at least some element of control. Ideally, well, it's worth noting, from our perspective, typically a smaller board is going to be better for the company. It'll be more nimble, fewer voices in the room. So to that end, the ideal board from our perspective, or at least from the company's perspective, might be 2 common directors, 1 director appointed by the holders of a majority of the preferred stock. The common holders retain the ability essentially to make board determinations, and perhaps we negotiate later on. I think we might get this in the next point. Perhaps we negotiate certain transactions that the company can't undertake without the approval of that investor designee.
Yeah, I mean, look, the board composition is pretty fundamental at any stage, but at this stage, it sets a precedent for the future, and you're never going to get more as a company, as a founder. You're never going to get more control over the board going forward. It's always going to slowly be, I don't want to say deteriorated, but you're slowly more and more people are going to creep in, independents, other investors. So it is important to be aware of what control the board, who controls the board at this stage. And you have to be a little bit careful about basically the investors effectively capturing the board control indirectly. So at this stage, the board can be anywhere from 3 to 5 people. It could be anywhere from all founders to a couple of founders, a couple of investors, and an independent. The typical, if you were actually raising an institutional round from, of real Series A round, we do typically see the investors insist on at least 1 and usually 2 board seats, but there's room for negotiation there. If you have 1 lead investor, you might be able to get away with just 1 investor board seat, and instead of having 2 investor board seats and 1 independent, maybe 1 investor board seat and 2 independents, while still maintaining 2 or in some cases even 3 founders on the board. That independence, well, there's 2 seats that you sort of have to be careful about. One is the CEO seat. Typically, the CEO is reserved, 1 seat on the board is reserved for the CEO. Now, initially, that's likely to be one of the founders, and as long as it's one of the founders, that founder stays in that seat. You've got an extra founder on the board. But what happens in the future if that founder is no longer the CEO? Suddenly, you could have a situation where instead of having 2 founders on the board, you only have 1 founder on the board, and that CEO seat has gone to somebody else, and it's likely somebody that isn't as founder friendly, right? Somebody who may be more neutral, maybe more investor friendly, but doesn't have that, isn't part of the founding team. The other seats to be careful of are the independent seats. These people are oftentimes connected in some ways with the investors because the investors have more business context. They're more likely to be able to suggest people that are relevant to the business and can be helpful, which is really important. But if push comes to shove, will they side with the investors on important business issues? So it's not that, it is pretty typical to have an independent or 2 on the board. It is typical to reserve a seat for the CEO, but you do have to think about how that's going to impact the composition of the board and the voting of the board going forward.
Yeah, those are all good points, and I think it's if nothing else, it should be clear that there are a lot of ways to skin this cat, and this is one of the items that you should be focusing on most intently. Because as Ben said, you will never have more control over the board than you will now.
And I think it dovetails nicely into the next issue, which is, there's going to be a handful of terms in the term sheet that you see where it talks about things that the investors specifically have a veto over, called protective provisions. And it's going to list a handful of things that you need to get a majority of the investors to approve in order to do. And there's going to be a handful of things that the board can approve, but it's going to require actions that are going to require that investor director, or in some cases more than 1 investor director, actually affirmatively vote in favor of. And those 2 things are related and also very different. And the critical thing is that things that require stockholder approval, it is a larger group of people that you usually have to get buy-in from. And there's no obligation on the part of a stockholder to vote in favor of anybody but themselves. On the flip side, directors, first of all, it's a smaller group of people. And second of all, directors have something called fiduciary obligations, fiduciary duties, that require them to take into account the best interests of the company as a whole when they are actually making a decision. So when you are looking at that list of protective provisions for the investors and also Series A director veto rights, you want to try to make sure that the things that are in the protective provision category are minimized, and they are things that really are fundamental to the investment, right? It's fair to say that the investors will have a veto over things that will materially disadvantage them relative to anybody else. You want to simply change the rights of the preferred stock, add a senior class of preferred stock. Those things typically the investors get a veto over. But if you're talking about day-to-day operations, borrowing money, entering into strategic relationships of some sort, hiring and firing officers and directors. Those are things that if the investors are going to get any sort of say in them, special say in them, they really should be, from the company's perspective, in the board's control and not in the investors' control. Matt?
Now, the flip side to that, of course, is that from the investor's perspective, you want to take all the fiduciary responsibilities out of play. If I'm the investor, I want any action that I want to prohibit, I want that to be in the protected. So assuming that the board composition and the preferred stockholder makeup sort of align with each other, I want everything to be in the protected provisions in the charter, because exactly as Ben says, I can do whatever I want. I can vote against something. I can just withhold my vote because I'm too busy and don't feel like dealing with it. And I don't open myself up, perhaps in my capacity as a director of the company to any liability here. I think one of the big takeaways and kind of the elephant in the room here is that, yeah, as you tick through that list in the term sheet that we provided, these are serious fundamental company actions. The company is giving up, the company, and really by extension the founders, are giving up a whole load of control over exactly the types of things that, you might be surprised that you have to give up control over. For instance, you're not going to be able to, at least in its normal formulation, you're not going to be able to sell the company without the consent of your preferred stockholders. You're not going to be able to layer in a senior security. So you do a Series A, you can't layer in a Series B with a senior liquidation preference. You may not be able to incur a material amount of debt. So if nothing else, I think it's important for the folks listening to recognize that, yeah, this list is onerous, but we wouldn't have included in that term sheet if it wasn't kind of what you should expect to see. Now, there are ways to negotiate some of these provisions. For instance, where there's a prohibition against selling the company. Companies with perhaps more leverage than others might be able to say that, well, okay, this prohibition on selling the company without our consent only applies if the sale price is, say, less than some threshold that we agree upon. So if, in other words, if as a result of the deal, we're going to get cashed out less than, say, 2x our investment amount, then we get an approval right over it. Similar with layering in a senior security, that we have approval rights over that unless the valuation in that new round is so high that, it's really in everyone's interest for that deal to go down. That said, those are edge cases and uncommon. The takeaway again is that you as company are going to be layering in a lot of restrictions on the company's ability to do the things that otherwise you didn't need anyone's approval to think about doing.
Yeah, and Matt, just given the time, I think we should jump to founder shares, which is our last major topic, and then we want to sort of run through some of these Q&As. So do you want to do the intro? Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So some or all of you may be more or less familiar with the concept of share vesting for founders. In its simplest form, the company and the other founders want to ensure that the principals are sufficiently incentivized and all aligned towards the company's mission. The best way to do that is to impose some sort of vesting schedule. In other words, that we're going to issue you, founder, 1 million shares on day one, subject to vesting. The typical vesting schedule is a 1-year cliff, 25% cliff, then rateable for the next 36 months thereafter. So in other words, of those 1 million shares, you become full owner of them 1 year after issuance, 25%, and then you vest a rateable amount every month thereafter for the next 3 years. Okay, well, what if you put that in place because you were working with good counsel when you started with your founding team, and you get to a Series A round and you're 95% vested? Unfortunately, you should expect that an investor will want to re-subject some of your shares to vesting. that percentage is highly negotiable. I see it anywhere from going back to, say, 25% vested to more likely maybe 50% vested. But you should know and expect that investors will want to make sure, especially at the earliest stages, that because they're investing in you, the team, as much as anything, that you, the team, are sufficiently incentivized and also disincentivized from leaving. The thinking being that if you leave, the company is going to need to reallocate the equity that it's repurchasing to somebody else to fill your shoes.
Yeah, and all I'll add is, this is a point where it reflexively founders want to fight on it, and I think that's sort of a good first instinct. But it is also a place where, especially if you have co-founders, your interest in the investors are somewhat aligned, because you never know what's going to happen with your co-founder, right? If your co-founder leaves, you don't necessarily want to be the one stuck there with somebody owning 25% of your company and you not being able to get any of it back, even though they're not doing anything. It is important from the company and the founder's perspective that you get credit for time served. You've been working on this company for 2 years already. You shouldn't be vesting, I don't think, 75% of your equity over the next 4 years. The typical vesting schedule for founders is 3 to 4 years. And so, take that into account. Use that as part of your negotiation. You can always say, look, you want to incentivize me to stick around? Give me more options. I'll stick around. That's just as valuable, right? But so there is absolutely a need to push back there. But it is also something where you want to think about, hey, what does this look like if somebody else, one of my co-founders leaves? So I want to dive into the Q&A. But before I do that, because there's a lot of stuff to cover here and because we couldn't possibly have gotten to all of it in an hour, I'm going to drop a comment into the chat, in the session chat here, with a link to a publication that we have called Anatomy of a Term Sheet. And you can download it from our website. And it is a little pamphlet that goes through all of these terms and more in more depth than we've had a chance to go through. And it really is a great resource. And it basically takes as its starting point the standard term sheet from the National Venture Capital Association. We update the pamphlet basically every year when the NVCA terms update. This one is from the end of last year, which is the last time there was a major update. So it's really a good resource, and I encourage you all to go and take a look. And with that, let's try to hit these Q&A. Matt, let's just go back and forth here. So I'll take Jennifer at 327 asked, who starts the term sheet? I think I published this first. I've heard that startup should make investors present first, but some angel groups require the startup to present a term sheet. So the answer is it depends on the round. At the stage of a Series A, where you're dealing with an institutional investor, typically a venture capitalist, the venture capitalist will present the term sheet. If you are doing an earlier round, a seed round, for example, where you aren't dealing with an institutional investor, you're cobbling together from a bunch of angel investors, whether it's a safe round, a convertible note round, or a seed preferred round, then it is typical for the company to present that term sheet first.
I wanted to quickly republish the question that I erroneously published earlier. And that's a good question. As seed becomes the new Series A, do we see this template term sheet that we provided being used in its same form for a price seed round? Sort of. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. There is also a resource out there, seriesseed.com. There is a shortened form of term sheet that you can get from that website. We often see that. Just as often, we'll see the Series A term sheet that we provided pared back a bit. But experience counsel and investors try not to reinvent the wheel too much, because we're all working off of the same template documents, more or less, of course, with edits around the margins. So it doesn't really behoove anyone to, really idiosyncratize the process.
Yeah, I think you get the same basic terms usually. It's just sometimes a little lighter.
Yeah.
So, all right. Whoops. Do you need a C Corp structure in order to raise a Series A round? No, you do not need a C Corp structure in order to raise a Series A round. It is more common. Usually, if you have an LLC, the question is going to be, should you be an LLC or should you convert? And if you can provide a compelling rationale for why it's best for your business to be a limited liability company, then I've seen plenty of investors do deals with LLCs. So it is not required.
Jordan's question about good resources to get further into this. Well, Ben mentioned our Anatomy of a Term Sheet earlier. Great resource. I understand he'll be posting that link. If you don't get it or otherwise you can't get it, reach out to either of us. We'll be happy to send it along. I read many years ago a book called An Entrepreneur's Guide to Business School. An Entrepreneur's Guide to Business Law by Dowshi and someone else. Forgive me. You'll find it. That's also a good book. Ben had his own rec.
Yeah. Here, Mastering the VC Game by Jeff Busgang from Flybridge Capital is another good one. And Jeff's distills things in a really coherent way. So it's another good source. There's also a remarkable amount of writing on the internet by lawyers and venture capitalists about these topics. Actually, at the back of the Anatomy of a Term Sheet pamphlet is a handful of resources that I've found over the years, websites that are good for this kind of material. So I would look there.
Hey, Ben, I was going to publish this one because I'm not sure how it got. You published that on top of me. Go for it.
This is a guy. Are Series A events typically dilution events, or is this typically an event where unissued shares are offered? So I think maybe the terminology just got a little confused. The answer is yes to both. In any type of financing, shares are being issued from the company. Because in order for the company to raise capital, in order for the money to come to the company has to be selling the shares. If the founders are selling the shares, right, or somebody else is selling the shares, the money goes to them. So it is inherently going to be previously unissued shares that are being offered by the company for sale. That is, by definition, dilutive. Because when the company issues new shares, when you're calculating your ownership interest, your ownership over the total ownership of the company, the denominator is increasing, and therefore your ownership, from a percentage standpoint, your ownership is going down. That's a little different from whether or not your ownership is decreasing in value. Decreasing in value has to do with what's the price at which the shares are being issued. But in terms of just, does your ownership, is it dilutive in the sense of, does your ownership percentage go down? The answer is yes.
And to sort of go at this from a slightly different perspective, if that's what Theodore is looking for, a lot of times, if we set up companies, we will authorize far more shares for issuance than we'll actually issue at the outset. We may authorize the company to issue 10 million shares, but then only issue the founders 3 million and just have a 7 million share buffer there. When you do a Series A or really any preferred stock transaction, that buffer, that doesn't matter. You need to amend your charter to authorize these new types of shares that you're issuing. So you're not going to be looking to whatever the delta might be between the number of shares that you currently have outstanding and what you've authorized. If all you have outstanding is common stock and you're issuing preferred stock, that delta there is not going to be relevant. I wanted to address a question that may have been inadvertently unpublished or answered. Lisa's question about, do you need to have a C Corp in place to do a Series A round?
I covered.
Oh, you did?
I did.
Oh.
Yeah.
Well, then forget that. Um,
I think
With-
Matt's is the last one.
Okay, well, from one Matt to another, how to strike a balance between, and it's a good question, how to strike a balance between negotiating for a higher valuation versus a valuation that puts you in danger of a down round. Well,
It's a good question.
it's a really good question. And I find it hard to envision a situation where you're negotiating with sophisticated VCs that are willing to give you such an overheated valuation, even in your mind, that you think it'll pose an issue for down future rounds. But it's it's an important point, which is that, well, I mean, it's a good question, and it gets at a slightly different point, which is that you don't want such an overheated valuation precisely for this reason. Your Series A investors, they expect that you're going to do your Series B round and there's going to be a bump in valuation of whatever multiple, and they can mark up their investment on paper. And this is part of your financing trend, your march toward monetization. So, if you're able to negotiate with them a valuation that is completely indefensible, and know that you're going to get pushback on either where it is right then or, with some step up as you go into your next round, then that's not going to do anyone any favors. It's going to set yourself up for investor relations issues with your Series A lead, and, get at all of the down round considerations that are out there. Sort of a rambling answer. Ben, I'm curious for your take.
Yeah, look, I think that it's less of a problem at the seed round or a Series A round than it is at a Series B or Series C round. Valuations tend to be more modest, but it is a concern, and I think it's worth having the discussion with the investor about it. I mean, look, if you are cognizant of the problem, which clearly, Matt, you are, you're probably less likely to run into that issue. We are in a hot market right now, and valuations are through the roof, and so that does happen. But I think it's something where it may be a good opportunity to say, all right, look, maybe I'm willing to take a slightly lower valuation in exchange for for being able to get better terms in other places, and some of the control terms, for example, that we talked about. I just saw Andy pop back up again. So, Andy, I know we're running out of time. Can I try? I see one more question here from Tori.
Sure.
In the comments or the chat. How do you see companies handle an even number of members? Should this always be avoided? Tori, I'm thinking I'm not sure if you're talking about an even number of board members or an even number of owners in the company. Board members. Thank you, Tori. There's a reason that boards are usually 3 or 5. It's because you don't want that kind of that deadlock. Sometimes we see boards at 4 for some short period of time. But if you currently have 4 board members, you probably should expect that at least one of them is going to have to drop off before at the time of the Series A round, because nobody wants to end up with a deadlock situation for a long period of time.
It's also worth noting that you should always keep in mind interested director considerations, especially with small boards. Any transaction, i.e., or for instance, a decision on perhaps whether to fire one of the founder level people, or the C-level folks, the person that is at risk of being terminated or that is negotiating some arrangement with the company for something else, they're going to be interested in that transaction. And typically you're going to be looking for disinterested director approval. So it's always worth keeping in mind what the calculus might look like if you have to subtract one of the founders from any of those determinations as well.
And I think we're out of time. So thank you all very much. And please feel free to reach out to me or Matt if you have further questions. We'd be happy to help.
Yeah, and I'd like to thank you all for your time. I really appreciate this. And a big thank you as well to the Startup Boston team, the rest of whom helped put this together. For those in the audience, we have more sessions coming up, so go ahead, check the agenda, both for today, tomorrow, and up until Friday for what's going on. We hope to see you all soon.
Take care. Okay, I think we're still on stage. How do I get off stage?
Trying.
You got off stage.
No, not that. Switch. Backstage.
I don't have a backstage button.